Hello, this is Chiak. Hello, this is Chiak. We are back with Dead Space Martyr, part 4, The Descent. We're just going to get right into it since it seems everyone is making all the certain convergence, I guess, so to speak. Convergence, best word to use. Convergence are happening. So, part 4, The Descent, 32. He was asleep, having nightmares again. He was running in a strange pressurized suit through narrow, bleak halls. Part of him knew it was a nightmare for a while, but knowing that didn't seem to help him control it, and gradually he forgot it wasn't real. Something was pursuing him, something with strange tusks in the place of hands and horns spouting at the joints of its limbs. Its body looked like it had its skin flayed off, or even worse, like someone had taken a human skeleton and pressed raw hamburgers to it. The bottom half of its face was falling apart. Its eyes gleamed yellow, glittering and burning. He realized he had some kind of weapon, a gun that sent a whirling blade projected on a beam of light. He kept turning around and firing the thing, watching it cut with a grating sound through the creature's legs, spraying blood and gore all over. Its legs were gone, but it still kept coming, posting the tips of its tusks against the ground and dragging itself forward, moaning. He cut off its arms and then its head, and finally it stopped. Thank God, he thought, and wiped the blood off his face. He had started to turn away when he heard something behind him. The creature was still writhing, flopping this way and that, changing. With a wet sound, it sprouted new arms and legs. It clambered up, roaring, and was after him again. Screaming, he turned and ran. Bad dreams? Asked the man beside his bed. He was a large man with a square jaw and white hair, dressed in a dark uniform of military intelligence. He was regarding Altman with a steady, aloof gaze. To either side of him were two even larger men who looked like they might be twins, dressed in street clothes. At a little distance was another man, smaller and wearing glasses. He looked vaguely familiar, but Altman couldn't quite place him. "Where am I?" asked Altman. "You're in your house," said the military man, in Chicxulub. "Where's Ada?" "Your girlfriend? She's not here. She's safe." "What do you mean safe?" asked Altman, starting to get out of the bed. The man raised a finger. Calmly but forcefully, the twins to either side of him took Altman by the arms and lowered him back onto the bed, holding him down until he had stopped struggling. Warily, Altman eyed them. "What are you doing here?" he asked the military man. He made the gesture and the other two let go and stepped back. "I came to see you," he said. "And who are you?" "Markov," he said. "Craig Markov." "That doesn't tell me anything," said Altman. "No," said Markov, "it doesn't." "And who are they?" he asked, gesturing to the other three men. Markov looked left and right. "These?" he said. "These are my new associates." The man with the glasses gave a smirk. "Tim, Tom, and Terry." "Which one is which?" "Does it matter?" asked Markov. "Look," said Altman, "you can't just break in here like this. You have no right to be here. I'm going to call the police." Markov just smiled. When Altman reached for his phone, he said, "Tom, Tim." The twins moved slowly forward, one of them putting his hands on Altman's wrist and squeezed until he dropped the phone. The other punched him once, softly, almost lovingly, in the side. He fell back on the bed, gasping. Tim and Tom wandered back behind Markov, watching Altman struggle to catch his breath. When he had calmed down, Markov said, "Feeling better, are we? Would you like a drink of water?" Altman shook his head. Markov snapped his fingers, and the man with the glasses tossed Altman a shirt and a pair of pants. You're in the right frame of mind now, said Markov. Get dressed. We're going to have a little talk. A few minutes later, he was sitting across the kitchen table from Markov, the other three standing next to the door leading in and out of the room. It's very simple, said Markov. You filed a grant to investigate Chicxulub crater. There's nothing wrong with that, argued Altman. That's what scientists do. I've already spoken to your friends, said Markov. Or rather, my associates have. We've determined that the person motivating this grant application was you. So? Markov gave him a cold look. Don't get cocky. If I have to, I'll have Tim break your arm, he said. Or Tom, said one of the twins from where he stood near the doorway. Or Tom, said Markov. He turned and looked at the twin. Don't worry, Tom. He has 2 arms, enough to go around. Then he turned back to Altman, looked at him with one eyebrow raised. I'm sorry, Altman said. That's better, said Markov. Your proposal for investigating the crater has been pulled from the grant proposal pool. It is now classified. The investigation of Chicxulub crater has become a military matter. So I was right, said Altman. About what? Asked Markov. You're not just trying to retrieve the submarine. You're trying to get at whatever is in the crater. You're a clever boy, said Markov. Maybe too clever for your own good. The reason I'm here is to find out how much you know and evaluate whether you would be a valuable member of our team. If you are, I am prepared to allow you to join us, in a limited capacity, of course. If not, I'll have to figure out something else to do with you. What do you mean by something else? Markov shrugged. Could be ship you back to your own sector. Could be having you put in confinement for as long as it takes us to get could be having you put in confinement for as long as it takes us to complete the project. Could be something a bit more serious. Behind them, the twins exchanged glances and smiled. I suppose, Mr. Altman, that it's up to you. Markov straightened in his chair, put both his hands palm down on the table. Well, Mr. Altman, shall we begin? Markov started off slow. How did you first realize there was something unusual going on in the crater? I detected a gravity anomaly. It wasn't the pulse signal? Altman shook his head. The pulse signal came later. Who told you about the pulse signal? Altman hesitated, tempted to lie, and then realized it didn't matter. Hammond was dead. And then, suddenly it clicked. He knew where he had seen the man with the glasses. Charles Hammond told me, he said. I believe your associates knew him. Markov looked back at Terry. The latter hesitated a moment, nodded. But we didn't kill him, said Tim. No, we didn't kill him, said Tom. No talking shop here, boys, said Markov. Terry, why don't you take Tim and Tom and wait for me outside? The 3 of them quietly left the room. How do I know you are who you say you are? Asked Altman. Markov turned back, his gaze steady. I wondered when you were going to get around to that. Either I am or I am not, he said. If I am, then it'll be worth your while to cooperate if it will get you on the expedition. If I'm not, then there's very little you can do about it. Whether you tell me the truth or not, you're probably in trouble either way. Tell me, what do you think you know? It's a reasonable enough gamble, thought Altman. I know that Dredger Corp is working with the military to salvage the submarine, so chances are he is what he says he is. The trick is knowing how to tell him enough to get him to bring me aboard on the project, but not so much that he thinks he's already gotten all he can out of me, that he doesn't need me anymore. He took a deep breath. I guess there's something in the heart of the crater, said Altman. Not a natural phenomenon, but something else. Go on, said Markov. Considering its location, it must have been there a very long time. How long? It might have been there thousands of years, or even longer. Why do you think so? The Yucatec Maya have a kind of mythology surrounding it. They call it the tail of the devil. He saw a gleam of something in Markov's eye. You told me something I didn't know, Altman, he said. How did you find this out? I'll give you more details if you bring me in on the project. Markov nodded, his lips tight. I'll let you get away with that. For a few minutes, anyway. What do you think it is? He asked. I have no fucking idea, said Altman. There's no room on the team for someone who doesn't have imagination. What do you think it could be? Altman looked down at the tabletop, at his hands resting clasped together on it, at Markov's hands still palmed down on the other side. I thought at first it might be a relic from some ancient civilization, but I've thought a lot about it, he said, and the only other thing I can come up with frightens me. He looked up, met Markov's gaze. An object sending a pulse signal from the center of a vast crater, perhaps buried since the creation of the crater thousands or hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago. What if it wasn't an asteroid that made the crater, but the object itself, striking the Earth? Markov nodded, which suggests that it was something that came from outer space, said Altman, which in turn suggests that it was something sent here by intelligent life outside of our galaxy. Which raises the question of why it was transmitting, said Markov. And who it was transmitting to, said Altman. And what? They sat in silence for a while. If that's what it is, Altman said, it'll change our whole understanding of life as we know it. Markov nodded, finally removing his hands from the table and putting them in his lap. When they returned, there was a gun in one of them. Altman, he said, what am I going to do with you? Are you threatening me? Asked Altman, his voice rising. He hoped he sounded tough and angry, that Markov wasn't detecting the fear that he felt. You obviously have guessed too much to be let go. You even guessed too much for me to just throw you in confinement. I have to decide whether to kill you or to take you with us. Altman slowly raised his hands. I'd rather you took me with you, he said, a quaver to his voice now. Not a shocking preference, considering the circumstances. Take you or shoot you, he mused. I can see advantages to both. Can you tell me anything else to tip the scales? Is there something else you forgot to add? Altman kept his hands crossed, afraid that if he moved them, Markov would see how much he was shaking. His mouth was very dry. His voice, when he began to speak, trembled. There is one other thing, he said. Yes, said Markov, casually cocking the gun. The villagers found something. A strange creature, humanoid but not human, that they're convinced is connected to the happenings in the crater. They burnt it, but there are still remains you can examine. I'll take you to them. Is that all? Altman swallowed. That's all. Goodbye, Mr. Altman, Markov said. He raised the pistol and pointed it at Altman's head, then started to squeeze the trigger. Altman closed his eyes and gritted his teeth. He heard the snap of the hammer, but no bullet came. He opened his eyes. Markov was watching him, intensely focused. All in good fun, he said. The gun was empty. Never intended to shoot you. Welcome to the team. He stood and extended his hand. Altman was still in shock and didn't move. Markov pried his hand apart from each other and shook one of them. You will be closely watched. You won't have free run of the facility, but I want you available if and when I need you. He leaned in closer. If you do betray me, Mr. Altman, I will kill you, he said in a low voice. Do you understand? Not if you understand. Altman understood. Very good, said Markov, and started for the door. I'll have Terry make your arrangements. All right, said Altman quietly. His hand on the doorknob, Markov stopped. He stood there a moment, his back to Altman. There's the question of your girlfriend, isn't there? He said. Oh shit, thought Altman. Markov turned around, looked at him with searching eyes. What should we do about her? You don't have to worry about her, said Altman. He tried to stay calm and expressionless as he said it, poker-faced, but his voice, he knew, was still trembling. But I want to worry about her, Altman, said Markov. Let's just say it'd be my pleasure. Look, said Altman desperately. I understand why you feel you have to take me, but Ada's different. She had nothing to do with any of this. She even tried to stop me from taking an interest in it. Let her go. Markov smiled. What you've just shown me, Altman, is that you care enough about her that I couldn't possibly think of letting her go. I believe she might come in handy. What are you planning to do with her? Mr. Altman, said Markov. Questions. Always questions. He opened the door and went out. 33. Terry and the twins stood over him while he packed. They hurried him along. They impounded his phone and his holopod, as well as his terminal. The twins sealing them up in a crater The twins sealing them up in a crate and carrying them off. You'll have them back once Markov has taken a look at them, said Terry. Except for the phone. Can't I at least call Field and tell him I won't be in? No. I need some time to wrap up my affairs. No. What about my family? They'll be worried. You're stalling, said Terry. None of that other stuff is important. What's important is doing the job and doing it right. You keep stalling and I'll give Mr. Markov a call, and we'll see how badly he wants you along. And then what? He'll kill me? Like he did Hammond? Terry winced. I resent the implication, he said. I saw him die, sure, but I didn't have anything to do with it. Then it was Tim and Tom. Not them either, said Terry. He looked at Altman in a way that made the latter realize he was genuinely confused and strangely vulnerable. What happened? He asked. You're just trying to question him. And he flipped out, said Terry. I've never seen anything quite like it. One moment he was running, and the next he was trying to kill us. He showed Altman an angry, awkward scar on his hand. We didn't even have any weapons. Tanner had just sent us there to talk to him. He rubbed his eye with his knuckles, and then suddenly he took his knife and cut his own throat. Never seen anyone cut quite that deep so quickly. Been dreaming about it ever since. Abruptly, he straightened up, his face becoming closed again. I don't mind being blamed for what I've done, but don't blame me for what I haven't. Come on, get moving. They walked quickly to the Dredger Corp building, Terry holding onto his arm and hurrying him along. A few people looked at them curiously in the streets, but most just ignored them or deliberately looked the other way. The building now had a security fence around it, made of welded wire mesh. The building itself had been razed to the ground and was in the process of being replaced by a structure formed of interlocking concrete and steel panels, more like a fortress than like a corporate building. Some changes being made, said Altman. Some changes being made, said Altman. Terry nodded. You don't know the half of it. He led them around behind the construction to a concrete pad. On it was a helicopter, blades already spinning. They hurried to it, and Altman climbed aboard. Ada was there, her face taut, drawn. He sat down next to her and she clung to him. She isn't usually like that, he thought. She must be terrified. Almost immediately, the helicopter took off. I've been worried about you, he said, having to shout to be heard over the noise. I thought they might have done something to you. I was worried about you too, she said. Are you okay? He offered her a feeble smile. No permanent damage. Michael, do you know where we're going? No, he said. I'm afraid I don't. I told you, she said. This would all end badly. I told you to leave it alone, but you wouldn't listen. It's not over yet, he said. He looked out the window. They had turned and were flying over the water now, were already fairly far from land. He looked around the helicopter at the other passengers. Terry wasn't there. Either he stayed behind or was up with the pilot. It contained 8 other scientists, all people he recognized by sight, even if he didn't know them all. Field was one of them, looking like he was sick to his stomach. Scud was there, as was Showalter. Holding on to the roof straps, he moved over closer to them. Where's Ramirez? He shouted. They didn't have him come, said Showalter. What did they do with him? Showalter shrugged. Did they give you a choice? Asked Altman. A what? Shouted Scud. Why are they taking us? A choice? No, shouted Showalter. We had to come. Do you know where we're going? Shouted Scud. Altman shook his head. I was going to ask you, he said. He clambered back to his bench. They don't know, he said. Nobody knows where we're going. They flew for roughly 3 hours. Direction, Altman thought, judging by the sun, was northwest, or west-northwest, though he wasn't exactly sure. At some point, he thought they turned south. How fast could a helicopter fly? 75 miles an hour? 100? It seemed like they were covering a lot of distance. Maybe they're just planning to kill us, he thought. Just pull all of us on the same helicopter and engineer a crash. If so, he realized, there was nothing he could do. He was already as good as dead. He sat on the bench, half deafened by the sound of the blades, his arms around Ada. It was his fault that she was here, he knew. He was to blame. Across from him, Scud looked haggard, exhausted. Time slowed. The hum of the blades fell an octave, and the craft slowed noticeably. They all started looking out the windows. Below was a cloud of mist, almost perfectly symmetrical, clinging to the water. They started moving down toward it. Altman began to catch glimpses of something within the cloud, a flash here and there, a strut or a bit of metal. They came down slowly, the blades of the helicopter making the mist roil. He could see the top of a large glass dome, the glass bluish, wet and iridescent in the sudden light. They came very close, hovering maybe 10 meters above it, and he thought he could see a glimpse of faces inside. He could see, on the metal struts and partitions of the glass, thousands of tiny jets, each of them releasing a fine spray of mist. Suddenly the jets stopped. The mist drifted around the structure for a moment and then slowly dissipated, revealing the dome and everything beneath it. It was a huge floating compound, hundreds of feet in diameter, made of a series of glass and plastic domes, connected or overlapped with frog eggs. Much of it descended well below the surface of the water. Indeed, as much of the structure seemed to be below water as above, perhaps more. The top of the central dome, where the metal supports met, had a flat spot. Carefully, the pilot brought the helicopter down. He touched once, but with one strut off the flat spot, and they began to tilt. He went up again. He came down even slower, and this time managed it. The cabin door opened from the outside. Two guards wearing dark military garb gestured to them to climb out. Almond expected the dome to sway up and down with swells, but it was big enough that he hardly noticed anything. He climbed down onto the deck, then turned to help Ada down. The others soon followed. Together they made their way to a hatch and climbed down it. By descending a short ladder, they reached a platform just under the roof of the dome. The platform had a transparent shaft in the center of it, one side of it open. As he looked at it, a lift rose up into it. The guards gestured and herded them into it. The lift began to descend. It was only once they were off the platform and moving down on the slowly descending lift that Ullman really got a sense of how big the dome was. They were probably 40 or 50 feet up. The large dome open and nearly empty, the foggy light dappling the glass walls and casting odd shadows. It was a hemisphere rather than a dome, a solid floor running along the bottom of it. Whether there was another reversed hemisphere below, there was no way to tell from here. Stacks of boxes and crates littered the floor along with partially assembled or perhaps partially disassembled machinery. Also military guards, lots of them, and some of them standing at attention or employed in some small task. Most of them walking and chatting idly, perhaps off duty. Here and there, a man in a white coat stood directing a group of them, getting them to lug equipment around. At the bottom of the lift, two more guards stood waiting to meet them. Scud began to ask a question, but one of the guards interrupted him. "No talking," he said. They kept the group there until everyone from the helicopter had made it down, then led them across the floor of the dome. Groups of guards stopped talking as they approached, following them with their eyes. Above, Altman heard the sound of the helicopter taking off again. Immediately, the nozzles began to spray and the outside world dissolved in a cloud of mist. The ambient light in the dome dimmed, grew somber. Someone shouted a command, and banks of harsh fluorescence lined along the struts flickered on. The dome brightened with an antiseptic light, inflicting the skin of everyone around them with an unhealthy glow. They came to the edge of the large dome and passed through a sliding door, moving into a much smaller one. Down through a pressure hatch, into a passage running around the edge of a third dome and curving slowly downward. Halfway around the passage, Ullman noticed the water lapping at the side of the tunnel, going higher with each step. There was a subtle change in the quality of the sound, as if everything here was slightly wrapped in cotton batting. He tapped the side of the corridor with his fingernails, heard only a dull, echoless sound. Something with a pale, stretched eye veered out of the depths and toward his hand, and then darted away again. A few steps later, the water rose all the way over their heads and closed over the top of the passage. They were completely below the surface. They left the corridor and came into a dome cast green from the reflection of the water. Fish and other animals swam around the floating compound, and here and there barnacles had begun to take hold. At a distance was a phalanx? At a distance was a phalanx of submarines, connected by a series of cables to the floating compound, pulling it very slowly along. Excuse me. "It's beautiful," said Ada. "It's terrifying," said Altman. The guard stuck the barrel of his gun firmly against Altman's rib, hard enough to hurt. "No talking," he said. They twisted to the bottom of the dome and took another lift down to a series of adjoining chambers, squarish rooms. They passed from one to the next, the guard keeping them in a straight line and hustling them along. It felt to Altman like he was being led to his own execution. Here the water was deeper, darker. The rooms had more metal in them than glass. They were all lit by the same harsh fluorescence. The guard hustled them into another slightly descending corridor, this one ending in the pressure hatch. Ullman judged that they were back near the center of the lab, though well below the waterline now. One of the guards opened it, ushered them through. The room inside resembled the bridge of a moon cruiser. It was a spherical chamber with a central elevated command chair. In all directions, down a few steps, were banks of controls, readouts, and holoscreens. And uninterrupted banks of windows ran along the upper half of the wall. The command chair was just enough above the rest of the lab to give an unimpeded view of the water in all directions. The chair spun around to reveal Markov. He looked down at them and smiled. Here, in this environment, with his jaw firm, here, in this environment, with his firm jaw and glittering eyes lit by the stark fluorescence, surrounded by water on all sides, he seemed like something monstrous pretending to be human. Ah, you've arrived, he said, without any warmth. Welcome to your new home. It took a while, but they eventually got used to their new quarters. The lab was nicer than any he'd ever seen, and was comprised only by his having to share it, just as he had in Chicxulub, with Field. He saw this as a particular bit of sadism on Markov's part, and even wondered if he brought Field along only to irritate him. They were still 3 weeks away from getting to the center of Chicxulub crater. The floating compound was towed forward very slowly, and sometimes, depending on weather conditions, had to be stopped. He initially thought the command center was the lowest point on the ship, but quickly realized that side corridors led to a tight sequences of chambers just below that. And below that, finally, was an even larger chamber, perhaps the largest chamber on the floating compound. It was carefully pressurized. It had a crane and a water opening. It had a crane and a water opening and a very high ceiling. It was a last-minute addition to the lab, Altman learned from one of the other scientists, and had been built specifically to accommodate the object in the heart of the crater. Everywhere Altman went, he was amazed. The floating compound, obviously built for a specific but different purpose, was being quickly retrofitted with state-of-the-art equipment. Almost hourly, boats and helicopters arrived, bringing not only brand new equipment, but also devices that were still in prototype phase. Expenses was no object. Whatever was down there, they were prepared to spend whatever it took to get to it. They ate metals and They ate metals. That's not it. They ate meals and shifts at the facility's cafeteria. The researchers stayed in dormitory rooms that, generally speaking, slept 6, though there were a few exceptions. Altman and Ada, the only couple on board, were grudgingly given a converted storage closet as a bedroom. It was just big enough to hold their bed and a narrow filing cabinet that they stuffed with their clothes and made into a dresser. But they were still glad for the privacy. As Altman got to know the others, he had to admit that Markov had assembled a first-rate team. Not knowing exactly what the thing in the crater might be, he had his bases covered. There were a few scientists whose fields were so cutting edge that there weren't names for them yet. There were geophysicists, astrophysicists, robotics experts, geologists, marine biologists, geneticists, oceanologists, engineers of various stripes, a mining foreman, an oceanographer, a seismologist, a volcanologist, a gravitologist, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, various doctors, a medic surprising in barotraumatism and decompression sickness, countless mechanics and technicians, a housekeeping and kitchen staff. There was even a linguist and, with Ada, an anthropologist. A number of them were researchers who, although quite famous, had vanished from the public eye years before. None of them would speak about what they'd been doing in the intervening years, and if pressed, spoke only of coming out of retirement. Retirement, my ass. Showalter whispered to him. Altman agreed. If they're here now was because they had been working covertly with military intelligence in the meantime. They were given away by being the only ones who didn't seem surprised at the massive expense and effort going into the expedition. They took it all for granted. What disturbed Altman even more were the number of military guards present and how actively they were training. It was clear, or in any case seemed to be clear, or in any case seemed clear to Altman, that Markov had some notion that they had to be prepared for combat. There were three possibilities for this that Altman could come up with. One, the least disturbing to him, was that Markov was simply being a soldier himself, that he thought the military weren't needed, but that as long as they were here, they deserved to be put through their paces. The second, more disturbing, was that Markov expected someone to try to take the object away from them, that he was aware there was competing interests trying to get their hands on it, or would be. The third, and worst of all, was perhaps Markov was expecting the object to fight back, which made Ullman realize he should have realized a long time before. Without having an altogether clear idea of what it was, Markov thought of the object at the center of the crater as a weapon. Maybe he wasn't intending the extraction for the betterment of mankind or the advancement of science after all. Altman talked it over with Ada, told her his suspicions. Does that surprise you? She asked. Markov's ruthless. He thinks of everything as a potential weapon, even people. He's a very dangerous man. He quickly found that a lot of places were out of bounds to him. There were certain areas, certain sets of laboratories, both below and above the waterline, that his keycard did not grant him access to. Sometimes he could get in following on the heels of a careless scientist or guard, but he was never allowed to remain long enough to get a good sense of what was happening. Other rooms were even more off limits, protected by round-the-clock guards. Field was in one of these, but when Altman asked him about it, he got nowhere, less because Field was suspicious and because Field didn't see enough of the big picture to understand what was actually going on. After just a few days, he started to notice he was being watched. It began as just a vague feeling, but grew stronger. He thought at first it was just paranoia, until Showalter noticed it as well. The guards regarded him in a different way than they did many of the other researchers. Whenever he spent some time alone in one of the corridors, often just gathering his thoughts, a guard suddenly showed up. Several of the technicians seemed to be paying him special attention. One man in particular, a man who always wore the same rumpled coveralls, seemed always to be lingering just behind him. What should I do? He asked Ada. What can you do? She said. If they want to watch you, they can watch you. There's nothing you can do about it. You're in their power. She was right, he knew. Who was he going to complain to? Markov? Markov had given him three alternatives: be part of the team, be locked up, or end up dead. Maybe Markov had had his cake and eaten it, too. Maybe he was both part of the team and locked up at the same time. The floating compound made a good prison, and it was a better alternative than being dead. What do you think is going on? He asked Ada. She rolled her eyes. I don't want it to start all over again, Michael. It's dangerous to ask yourself these questions. So what if we can't go on into certain places of the ship? We're not the only ones in that position. Most of the researchers from Chicxulub are being treated in exactly the same way. Not Field, said Altman. Field has access. Limited access, she said. One room only. I've been watching. Showalter and Scud don't, she said, ticking them off on her fingers. Love the others don't as well. He didn't answer, just turned away, thinking. There were ways of finding out. All he'd have to do was to replicate a card, and then his thoughts were interrupted when she slapped him on the cheek. Don't, she said, pointing a finger at his face. What? I know what you're thinking, she said. You don't need to have full run of the place in order to do your job. If you did, you'd only get into trouble. I want you to promise me you'll leave it alone. He looked at her for a moment, finally shook his head. I can't, he said. She slapped him once more for good measure and turned away. Not knowing what else to do, wrapped his arms around her to prevent her from going. She struggled at first, not willing to meet his eyes, but he kept hold of her until she finally began to soften a little. You never listen to me, she said. I'm always right, and you never listen. I always listen, he claimed. I just don't always do what you say. Finally, she met his eyes. Damn it, Michael. Promise me you'll be careful this time, she said. Be discreet. Promise me you won't do anything to end up dead. All right, he said, finally letting her go. That I can promise. He was careful. He learned more about the floating compound talking to some of the mechanics and engineers. It was a converted semi-submersible rig, mobile, made to float half in the water and half out. The mist, which they referred to as a blur effect, was sprayed by high-grade jets, their apertures less than 100 microns in diameter. The water was forced through the jets and into extremely fine needle points, causing it to atomize into droplets so small that most of them remained suspended in the air. If anyone with any sort of advanced equipment wanted to determine what was in a cloud, they would have no difficulty, but it was enough to keep at least a few of the curious ships and boats away. On the second or third day, a sturdy man with an exceptionally frizzy red beard joined them in the cafeteria. He stretched one large hand across the table, shook Altman's hand. Jason Hendricks, he said. You're new here, aren't you? Altman nodded. Michael Altman, he said. I just got here. Hendricks gave a slow, easygoing smile that Altman immediately liked. None of us have been here for long, he said. I just got here a week or so ago myself. He began to eat, and almost immediately his beard was full of crumbs and scraps of food. What brings you here, Michael? Altman thought a moment about what to say, finally settled on, they're still figuring out what to do with me, I'm afraid. Me? I'm a pilot, said Hendricks. He rubbed his nails through his beard, working to work the crumbs out, and then wiped his palm on his shirt. Submarines, mostly. Was trained by the Navy to pilot a mid-sized sub. Also did some work with submersibles for a construction firm. You must enjoy it. I like it well enough, said Hendricks. Also spent some time in a small one-man affair working for treasure hunters in the Caribbean. Had to reconsider that line of work when I realized the treasure they had me looking for was a sunken boat full of heroin. Probably a good decision, said Altman. Probably, said Hendricks, his eyes crinkling up warmly as he smiled. Though maybe if I'd stuck with it, I'd be rich by now. Either that or very, very high. You think I'm going to have the same ethical dilemma with this job? They met the next day at the same table, and then the next, and soon Altman had come to think of Hendricks as a friend, as someone he could trust. After a few days, Hendricks told him more about what he was doing, that he was to be on a two-man team working with a bathyscaphe. He had little enough experience with bathyscaphes, but wasn't worried. There was still plenty of time before they arrived. I'm slated to co-pilot with some deep-sea explorer guy named Edgar Moresby, he told Altman. Man in his late 60s and has dark skin that looks like it's been cured. Drinks like a fish. Not much of a pilot as far as I'm concerned. Claims to be descendant of Robert Moresby. Who? Asked Altman. Hendricks shrugged. Don't ask me. Some Brit hydrographer and naval officer. He brings it up any chance he gets. Sorry, I lost my place. Moresby had no interest in going out on Hendrick's practice runs, claiming he could pile a bathyscaphe drunk and in his sleep. And I often have, he had told Hendricks. No better way of getting the job done, if you ask me. But as long as he had the choice, he preferred to do his drinking in the privacy of his own berth. That leaves me a dilemma, said Hendricks. I can't go out alone. What if something goes wrong? Altman waited for a few moments so as not to appear too eager before answering. I'll go with you, he said, trying to sound casual. Would you? Said Hendricks, and gave Altman a warm smile. That'd be a big help. He fully expected Markov to find out and put a stop to it, but either news hadn't gone back to him, or he didn't care that Altman was going out in a bathyscaphe. He didn't learn much new from either the bathyscaphe or Hendricks, but he was at least keeping busy. Plus, Altman quickly found that he had an aptitude for piloting. He knew instinctively how much to flex the controls to get the bathyscaphe to perform how he wanted it to. When asked to dive to a certain depth or raise to a certain level, he could let in just enough water or release enough air. Sorry, I'm totally losing track. When asked to dive to a certain depth or rise to a certain level, he could let in just enough water or release by feel just enough pellets to do it smoothly and precisely. He found it curiously satisfying and gratifying in a way that geophysics never had been. You should have been piloting instead of me, said Hendricks one day. Yeah, right, said Altman. I don't think Markov would ever agree to it. But surprisingly enough, when Hendricks asked Markov, he did agree. It'd be good to have a backup pilot, Markov claimed, in case anything went wrong. But that was not to say that Altman was off the hook for his other tasks. He'd still be expected to follow any instructions that the lead researchers gave him, and to continue to take his geophysical readings. It was just that now he might sometimes be asked to take these readings below the water, from within the bathyscaphe. Excuse me. Another drink of water and literally falling asleep for whatever reason. Okay. Oh my god. Why am I so tired? 34. They were still 6 or 7 days away from the center of the crater when Markov decided, without warning, to put the bathyscaphe through deep water tests. Hendricks and Moresby were to be carried by freighter 30 miles or so ahead of the facility. There they were to dive as deep as they could until they reached the ocean floor. Test the equipment, the air systems, the communication systems, sonar, lighting, etc. Take a few readings, remain in place for at least an hour, then ascend. 2 submarines were to go along and stand by in case assistance was required. Hendricks showed up at Altman's door shortly before he was scheduled to leave. He looked nervous. I've got a problem, he claimed. It's Moresby. He tied one on last night as soon as he heard we'd be going down. Is he all right to go down? Right now he can't even see, said Hendricks. I've been trying to walk him out of it, but I've got to supervise the transfer of the bathyscaphe. Do you think you... He trailed off, waited. Maybe you should say something to Markov, said Altman. I don't want to do that, said Hendricks. He already warned Moresby once, and I don't want to do anything to get him fired. I know it's a lot to ask, but will you look in on him? See if there's anything that can be done? Altman nodded. But I'm doing it not for Moresby, but for you. Hendricks smiled. Thanks, man. I owe you one. Altman clambered through the tunnels and up the deck to Moresby and Hendricks' cabin. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He hesitated, knocked again. When there was still no answer, he tried the door and, finding it unlocked, entered. It was a narrow space with 2 berths. The top belonged to Hendricks, the bottom to Moresby. The room reeked of vomit. Moresby was half in and half out of the bottom bunk, as still as a corpse. Ullman shook him. At first there was no response. After a few minutes of shaking, he groaned slightly, eyes barely opening before closing again. Ullman shook him hard, slapped him. Moresby blinked, coughed. "Give me a minute to steady myself," he said, and groped a bottle off the floor beneath the bed. "You don't need any more," said Altman. "Come on, get up." "Who are you to tell me what I need?" asked Moresby. He tried to stand up and nearly fell. "I'm a Moresby, by God, a descendant of—" He was still babbling out his pedigree while Altman dragged him down the hall and thrust him fully clothed into the shower, turning the cold tap all the way open. A moment later, Moresby was shouting. 10 minutes later, he was dressed in dry clothes and subdued. He was pale, was sweating a sour smell, and his hands were still shaking, but he was more or less presentable. "You're all right?" asked Altman. "Just nerves," said Moresby. "I'll be right once I'm down there." Altman nodded. "You won't tell anybody, will you?" said Moresby, refusing to meet his gaze now. "Hendricks doesn't want me to. If it was up to me, I would." He led Moresby to the submarine bay, where Markov was planning to pass them in review before leaving. The submarine pilots were already there, the bathyscaphe transferred. "You stay here," said Altman. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to find Hendricks." It might have been different if he found Hendricks sooner, or if the other submarine pilots had kept an eye on Moresby, or if Markov had come right away before Moresby had had time to have second thoughts. But it took almost half an hour for him to arrive. As it was, Hendricks and Altman made it back just a few moments before Markov, and it wasn't until he started speaking that Altman realized Moresby was nowhere to be seen. Markov took the review very seriously. He wore a freshly pressed dress uniform and was flanked by 2 guards on either side. He thanked the pilots and crews and technicians for their efforts, reminded the other 2 submarine crews that they would stand by on the freighter in case anything went wrong, and the bathyscaphe failed to rise. As for the bathyscaphe, if, for any reason, Hendricks and Moresby... He stopped. "Where's Moresby?" he asked. Hendricks looked around. "He was here just a moment ago, sir," he said. In the end, 2 guards discovered him. He managed to find a bottle somewhere and had downed a good bit of it. Drunk, he had fallen from one of the lifts and broken his neck. "It's my fault," Altman thought. "I should have watched him more carefully." He looked over and caught Hendricks' eye, realized that Hendricks was thinking much the same thing, was blaming himself. Markov, however, didn't react at all and rejected out of hand Hendricks' request to put the dive off for a day of respect for the dead. "Just as well," he said, when the body was brought to him. "That way we'll be sure to get the geophysical readings right. Sound all right to you, Altman?" He had to repeat it twice before Altman realized he was being addressed. "Fine," said Altman, trying not to stare at the body, at the way the head hung at an odd, impossible angle. They took a boat to the freighter in silence, the bathyscaphe being towed behind. Once there, the guards held the bathyscaphe steady as they loaded on. "I'm still a little shaky," said Hendricks. "I lived with Moresby, after all. If it's all the same to you, with you, I'll let you drive." Though a little shaky himself, Altman was happy to have the distraction of working with instruments. He eased them slowly down. Before long, they were resting steady on the ocean floor. "How deep are we?" asked Altman. "Not nearly as deep as we'll be in the center of the crater," said Hendricks. 2,000 meters, I'd guess. "Have you ever been this deep before?" Hendricks shook his head. "Almost," he said, "but not quite." It was peaceful there, thought Altman. Soothing almost, like they had come to the end of the world. He liked listening to the quiet whir of the air recirculators, liked watching the dark, almost empty world outside. Okay, just trying to get a gander of how much is left. So again, for some reason, my eyes are trying to close. I have no idea why. So tired for some reason. 35. A week later, they arrived, and everybody was eager to get to work. They started by taking readings from the surface, from a launch that rose and fell with the swell of the waves. Field was with him at first, taking readings of his own and double-checking Altman's, though he became greener and greener as the afternoon went on. He spent the last hour of the day hanging over the launch's side, retching. But the next morning, a groaning, vomit-flecked Field had been shipped back to the floating compound, and it was just Hendricks and Altman. They brought the bathyscaphe down 1,000 meters, and took their readings there, waiting for confirmation from Markov to descend further. When it came, they went down to 2,000 meters and repeated the process. Seems straightforward, said Altman. Hendricks shrugged. More or less, he said. Only problem is that down this deep, communication gets erratic. It's hard to know if they'll receive the data we're sending. We might be cut off? Asked Altman. It comes and goes, said Hendricks. Nothing to worry about as long as nothing goes wrong. Through the front observation porthole, Altman thought he could see pinpricks of light from the excavation below, from the robot diggers, but it was too far away to make anything out. We could go down to 3,000 meters, take readings, and then come back up. Oh, said Altman, I've got more than enough air for you. You're the boss. Up to you. Hendricks said, Have you heard the stories about the other bathyscaphe? I've seen the vid, Altman said. What do you think happened? I don't know, said Altman. Doesn't it worry you at all? I don't know, said Altman. I want to know what happened, but I'm not worried exactly. Does it worry you? Hendricks nodded. Let's take it slow. There's no point in rushing things, he said. On the other hand, if I'm reading the data right, the pulse signal is starting again. Really? Said Altman, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. Are you certain? Hendricks hesitated, then nodded slowly. It's very slight. I caught it at 2,000 meters, but not at 1,000. But it's there. What does it mean that it's back? Asked Altman. Maybe we should keep going down after all. Who knows how long it will last? We need to record it while it's still broadcasting. But Hendricks had one hand cupped over his earpiece. Too late, he said. They're ordering us back up. They looked at each other for a long moment. You said yourself that communications are intermittent, said Altman. How will they know we got the message? Hendricks shook his head. If we don't get the okay to go down to 3,000 meters, we're going to go back to the surface anyway. That's protocol. If we disobey, what do you think the chances are of them letting us near our bathyscaphe again? We can't do it. Half a dozen counter-arguments fired through his head and then quickly dissolved. Hendricks was right. There was no choice. The signal would have to wait. A contingent of guards was waiting for them by the time they opened the hatch and stepped out in the submarine bay. They were hustled down to the command center, which was already occupied not just by Markov, but also by a half-dozen researchers, all of them part of Markov's inner circle. Not men from Chicxulub. They looked stern and serious. The pulse signal has started again? Asked Markov. You're sure about this? Why the hell wouldn't we be? Said Altman. The instruments don't lie. He gestured at the researchers. But you apparently wanted a second opinion. Why don't you ask them? It's much weaker than it was before, said one of the men. We know this, said Altman. Maybe it's not the same signal after all, said another. Maybe it's static and feedback from the MROVs, and robotic units that are handling the excavation. Just barely possible, said Ullman. But not at all likely. It's the same signal. Did you feel anything unusual? Sense anything strange? Asked Markov. Ullman shook his head. No, he said. What about you, Hendricks? I don't know, sir, said Hendricks. You don't know? When I reached 2,000 meters, I started to feel a little strange. It felt like a premonition or something. Stevens, said Markov, and one of the researchers came forward. He was distinguished looking, but had a relaxed, kind face. Take Hendricks and work up a full psychological profile. If you get any sense of a problem, you're authorized to take him off duty. If he looks fine to you, we'll have both of them in the bathyscaphe first thing tomorrow. That night, Altman's dreams began again. He woke up drenched in sweat in the middle of the night and found he could not move. He was jittery, little flashes of light going off behind his eyes, and he had a sense of dread that refused to leave him. It took a long time for him to become aware that he wasn't back at his house in Chicxulub, but when he did, he imagined shape of the room around him became amorphous and vague. His heart began to pound heavily, and he could hear the blood in his ears. The space around him remained undetermined in the darkness. It was like he was in a place that wasn't a place at all, like he was suspended in the void. He tried again to move, but still couldn't. Am I still dreaming? He wondered. And then, only very slowly, did he realize where he might be, in the floating compound. That sounds just beside them, the sound of Ada breathing in her sleep. And suddenly he found he could move again. He got up, drank a glass of water, and got back into the bed again. Ada moaned in her sleep. He wrestled with trying to fall back asleep when he heard a knock on his door. It was Stevens. Almond, isn't it? He whispered. Yes, Almond said. Can we go somewhere to talk? Almond slipped into his pants and shirts and tiptoed out of the room, following Stevens down the hall. The man keyed an empty lab open, ushered Altman inside. What's this about? Altman asked. You haven't noticed anything unusual about Hendricks, have you? Asked Stevens. Is anything wrong? Nothing wrong with the scans, said Stevens. Nothing wrong with the tests either. But there's still something bothering me. I can't quite put my finger on it. He seems normal, stable, but different somehow. He seems the same to me, said Altman. Maybe it's just the pressure, said Stevens. Maybe he's nervous, but feels like he's holding something back. Altman nodded. Since you're going to be alone with him in the bathyscaphe, and the one to suffer if things go wrong, I thought I'd talk to you about it. I don't know what to say, said Altman. He seems fine to me. I've never had any problems with him on a dive, never sensed any nervousness. I trust him. No, he said. I'm not worried about him. In fact, I'm a lot less worried about him than I'd be confined in the bathyscaphe with many of the other people in this facility. Stevens nodded. We want to be careful, he said. You can understand that, considering what happened with the last bathyscaphe. We don't want anything going wrong. All right, he said. I'll tell them we can move forward. We can move ahead. Sorry, I'm just going to check my time quickly. 36. No reason to be nervous, Hendricks said. It's just like any other day. Ullman got the feeling that he was saying it to try to convince himself. No worries, he said. It'll be a piece of cake. They went down to 1,000 meters, the sickly sea life at first present, and then slowly dwindling. Then 2,000, the sea becoming more and more deserted, but still a few flickers of life. The photophores of a viperfish passing and spinning away into the darkness. A bony fangtooth, caught briefly in the lights, looked like a half-formed thing. A baby scaphoid squid that resembled a disembodied head made of glass. At 2,700 meters, they could make out the lights below, no more than pinpricks in the darkness. Slowly they grew. Altman was still watching them when he heard a whimper behind him. He turned. Hendricks was pale and stiff-faced. Tears were dripping slowly from his eyes. He didn't seem to be noticing them. Oh God, thought Altman. Something's wrong. Maybe I was wrong to tell Stevens to let Hendricks go ahead with the dive. But even then, he didn't feel nervous for himself, only worried for Hendricks. Hendricks would never do anything to hurt him. What's wrong? Altman asked. I don't want to die, he sobbed. You're not going to die, said Altman. Don't worry. Hennessy and Dantec. What happened to them? We're not meant to be down here, Altman. I can feel it. Altman slowed back the scaff until it was descending almost unnoticeably. If you want to go up, we can go up, said Altman in a level voice, trying to make Hendricks look him in the eye. I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to do. But now that we're here, we should take the readings. You don't mind doing the readings, do you? Hendricks took a deep breath, blinked his eyes, seemed to grab a hold of himself. Yes, he said. I'm good at the readings. I can do that. I need something to do. He let Hendricks busy himself with the machinery while he continued to ease the craft down. Hendricks began running through them rapidly, Altman checking his work. The signal pulse was there, much stronger at this level. They should measure it again at 2,000 feet on the way back up, Altman thought. Maybe the signal was growing even stronger. Then Hendricks tried to measure again. This time there was nothing. The signal pulse was gone. Altman took a reading himself just to make sure. Same result. He tried it again, and it was back. So, Altman thought. The pulse signal was pulsing on and off, sometimes there, sometimes not. Maybe a problem with the transmitter, some irregularity or corrupted circuit. Or maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was sending them a message. He glanced over at Hendricks. Was he going to be able to hold it together? Should he try to get him up to the surface as quickly as possible? Good, Hendricks, Altman said. These are excellent readings. Let's change our strategy for a moment. Instead of trying to record the level of synchronically, let's take a diachronic profile and see if we can figure out what the pulse is doing over time. Would Markov want that? Asked Hendricks. I think he'd welcome it, said Altman. I think he'd congratulate us for taking the initiative. Altman shrugged, holding his face utterly neutral. Not too long, he claimed. When Hendricks nodded, he showed him how to recalibrate the device and start it recording. Altman himself kept the bathyscaphe descending, extremely slowly now. Below maybe 50 meters farther down. Maybe the robot's dread and the MROVs. Most of the MROVs had stopped, he saw, were on standby, waiting for the next command from the surface. The signal wasn't reaching them. He made a mental note to suggest the arrangements he made a mental note to suggest that arrangements be made to control the MROVs from the bathyscaphe rather than from the floating compound. The machine that was still working had clearly a large circle of the ocean floor of muck and slurry, digging down to more solid rock. They had begun to break this up as well. and carted away, digging downward to form a funnel. The machine at the bottom were perhaps another 200 meters down. It was difficult to judge. The water was murky with mud, rock particles, and matter of other sorts from the rock they were renovating. They were deeper than Altman had thought they would be. Markov must have started them digging well before the filling compound was moving into position. He descended a few meters into the comb the MROVs had dug out and then stopped. If he went too much farther, he would be risking being jostled by one of the robotic dredgers, moving into and out of the holes. He decided to wait until he could control the dredgers and MRVs from the bathyscaphe and move them out of the way. Besides, there was Hendricks to consider. He turned back to Hendricks. "How are you doing?" he asked. "My head hurts," said Hendricks. "That's normal," claimed Altman, though he wasn't entirely sure it was. His own head didn't hurt, or at least not any more than usual. And since the cabin was pressurized, the descent shouldn't have had any effects. "It was just from the pressure," he lied. "We'll go away soon." Hendricks nodded. "Oh, right," he said, and gave a weak smile. "Normal." And then he squinted at the observation porthole. "I think my father's out there," he said, his voice filling with wonder. Startled, Altman asked, What did you say?" "My father," Hendricks said again. He waved. "Hi, Dad." Altman started the bathyscaphe ascending gently, never taking his eyes off Hendricks. "No, I'm sorry, Jason. It doesn't seem possible." After a moment staring out the glass, Hendricks gave a little laugh. "No, it's okay," he said. "He explained it to me. He is dead, and so the pressure can't hurt him." "If he's dead, he's not here," said Altman. "If he's dead, he's not anywhere." "But I see him," said Hendricks, starting to get a little angry. "I know what I see." "All right, Hendricks," said Altman, smiling and keeping his voice level. "I'm sorry." Hendricks turned back to the observation porthole, mumbling to himself. Altman risked glancing down at the instruments. The pulse signal had increased in intensity just around the time that Hendricks had started seeing his father. He told himself that that wasn't logical, that it was just a coincidence. But it was hard for him to believe that. A dip back down again, and he watched Hendricks' eyes, which had been intensely regarding the observation porthole, suddenly go out of focus. He snapped his fingers in front of his eyes. "Hendricks, look at me. Look here." Hendricks began to, and then stopped, his eyes drifting back to the porthole. Another glance, the signal had gone up again, was even stronger than it had been before. "He wants us to come in," said Hendricks. "He's cold out there. Don't worry, Dad. I'll help you." "Okay. I don't think that's such a good idea," said Altman. Hendrick got up from his chair and stumbled to the observation porthole, knocking his head against the glass. He hit it with his head, again and again. Hendricks, said Altman, grabbing his arms. "Don't." Hendricks shoved Altman off. Hendricks shook Altman off and then elbowed him in the face, causing him to... Hendricks shook Altman off and then elbowed him hard in the face, knocking him out of the chair. "Come in, Dad," he was shouting now. "Come in." Altman pulled himself up and moved to the far end of the cabin. The controls, he realized, had been knocked in the struggle. They were descending again, slowly, and he hoped he could stop it before they plowed into a dredger. Hendricks was pounding on the porthole with his fist now, stopping only to claw at its edges with his fingernails. Altman searched frantically for a weapon. There was nothing, at least nothing he could immediately see. He searched his pockets, his person. Nothing. He crept forward, crouching. He reached past Hendricks' waist and flicked the lever even, was trying to nudge it forward to make the craft rise when Hendricks cried out and knocked him to the floor. "Don't touch him," he screamed. Dazed, Altman stared at the base of the console. He's going to kill me, he suddenly realized. I was wrong. I signed my death warrant when I cleared him. He didn't want to die. There had to be a weapon somewhere. Slowly, trying not to alert Hendricks, he wriggled backward and away from him. Once he was as far away as he could get, he sat up with his back to the bulkhead and removed his shoe. The shoes were modified Blichers, with a pebbled Vibram sole for a hard heel in back. The sole flexible and with a snap to it. He stood up, took hold of each shoe by the toe box, made a chopping motion with his arms. Yes, he thought, it might be enough. You're not going to get him inside that way, said Altman. You need to bring him through the hatch. Hendricks stopped, turning around to look at him. I thought you didn't want him to come in, he said suspiciously. Are you kidding? Said Altman. I heard your father was a great guy. He is a great guy, said Hendricks, and smiled. Fine, said Altman. Then what are we waiting for? Let's get him in here. Hendricks stumbled towards the hatch, then stopped. Wait a minute, he said slowly. Why are you holding your shoes? Oh shit, thought Altman, but tried to stay calm. They're my favorite shoes. I thought I'd give them to your father. This answer seemed to satisfy Hendricks. He nodded once and turned towards the ladder leading up to the hatch. As soon as his hands touched the ladder rails, Hendricks was on him, hitting him as hard as he could in the back of the head with the heel of each shoe in turn, employing the shoe like a blackjack. Hendricks swayed, started to turn. Altman struck him again, then again. He crumbled and collapsed into a heap. Sorry about that, said Altman to an unconscious friend. I couldn't think of any other way. He quickly stripped off Hendricks' shirt and undershirt. He tore them into strips, twisted them into ropes. These he used to tie Hendricks' hands and arms behind his back, and then hog-tied his legs to his hands. He sat down and put his shoes back on, then examined the controls. Nothing had been hurt that he could see. They were floating just above and to one side of the hole the robotic units had dug out, probably carried there by some deep water currents. He was about to start back up again when something caught his eye. An odd fish, drifting awkwardly in his lights. It had a flayed, incomplete look. It was less like the prehistoric-looking creatures he had seen so far on the dive than the corpse of a ship that had been dead and floating in the water for a few days. And yet, as he watched it, it moved under its own power. There was something else puzzling about it. Rather than a long, slender body like a viperfish, or a thick, bulbous one like a lanternfish, it looked like a fish that had been folded in half and then glued together. The head was surmounted by a wavy, translucent curtain of flesh that resembled nothing so much as a tail. In the place of fins, it had what looked like little spurns of bone undulating from its side. As he watched, a snaggletooth entered the lights, and the first fish darted toward it. The first fish caught the snaggletooth on its spurs and, undulating, began to tear it apart until the other fish was dead and in pieces. Intrigued, Altman pressed the button and filmed the end of the fight, and the fish as it passed in front of them and into the darkness. And then he saw something else even stranger. Here and there, floating through the water, were patches of what looked like flat, pale, pink clouds. At first he thought it was a ray, but it wasn't differentiated in a way a ray was. It was just floating, billowing sheets of something. A strange jellyfish, maybe. A fungus of some kind. He nudged the bathyscaphe in for a closer look. When the craft touched it, it draped over the hull it draped over the hull, then split apart, slowly reknitting after their passage. Some of it, though, adhered to the observation porthole and remained there, caught on the rivets. Well, I'll be damned, said Altman. Behind him, Hendricks groaned. He was tied up, but who knew how long his bonds would hold? They had to get to the surface as quickly as possible. He turned off the override to the pellet release and had pressed the button. The bathyscaphe began to rise. "37. He started broadcasting a loop SOS at 2,500 meters, but got only static. Hendricks was starting to come around. By 2,000 meters, he was back to his hysterical babbling. Altman tried to ignore it. Through his earpiece, Altman caught brief bits of something that he recognized as a human voice submerged in a wash of static. By 1,700 meters, it was less static than voice, but Hendricks was shouting now, straining at his bonds. "Michael Altman, please respond," he finally heard the voice say. "Michael Altman, do you read?" He turned the loop off and went live. "This is Altman," he said. The other voice started to answer and was suddenly interrupted. Markov's voice came on. "Altman?" he said. "What the fuck is going on?" Hendricks flipped out. Altman said, "I've got him tied up. That's him screaming in the background." "What happened?" "Just a minute," said Altman. Hendricks had started to work his way loose. He took off his shoe again and slowly crept up next to him. "Altman?" Markov's voice was saying in his ear. "Oh, you all right, Altman?" He struck Hendricks hard in the back of the head twice, and he stopped moving. "What was that sound?" asked Markov. "That sound was the sound of me trying to stay alive," said Altman. He undid the ligature and hog-tied Hendricks. "I'll tell you more when I get to the surface," he said. "Oh, and it might be a good idea to have a few guards on hand in the submarine bay." Markov had started to speak again, but Altman turned the transmitter off. He began to think. It wasn't likely that Hendricks would break free. As long as he didn't forget about him, things would be okay. He looked out the observation porthole. The tatter of the pale pink substance was still there on the rivets, undulating slightly as the submarine rose. He knew if Markov saw it, he'd take it away for testing by members of his inner circle, and he, Altman, wouldn't hear anything further about it. Same with the footage of the unusual fish. He removed his holopod from his pocket and connected it to the console, then copied the vid footage of the fish onto it. He'd have to leave it in the system as well. Markov and his minions would no doubt... Nope, not going to sneeze. Okay. Markov and his minions would no doubt be able to tell if something had been erased, but maybe they wouldn't be able to tell it had been copied. He had to try to find some answers on his own. The pink swath was a little harder, but a plan began to form in his mind. He checked the pulse signal monitor. The signal had fallen off again. He checked back through the history. If the pattern continued, it should start to rise again. What he was planning to do was dangerous. No doubt Ada would tell him to leave it well enough alone, that he was only likely to get himself killed, which was why he would never tell her about it. Maybe she was right, but his desire to know was much too great. He slowed the bathyscaphe as he came up, trying to time it so that the signal would be strongest and Hendricks would be regaining consciousness just at the moment the craft moved into the submarine bay. Hendricks was groaning, his eyes fluttering. By the time they were fully in, Altman knelt down and undid the ligature that hog-tied Hendricks, then undid the rope around his leg, but left his hands tied. He unrolled one of the ropes and tore a square of fabric off it, which he tucked into his pocket. Then he helped Hendrix get to his knee. It was cruel, but he couldn't think of another way. "Where's your father, Hendrix?" he asked. The man's eyes focused briefly, then moved independently of each other, wandering about the sockets. "Hendrix," he said again. He had to hurry. The bay was almost drained down to the catwalk. Soon enough, water would be pumped out, and the guards would be there. "Where's your father?" Hendrix's eyes focused again, and this time stayed focused. "My father," he said. "He was just right here." "We left him down there," suggested Altman. "We abandoned him. You abandoned him." For a moment, there was no response. And then abruptly, Hendrix let out an ungodly howl of pain and slammed his head into Altman's chest. It hurt like hell. Then he fell on top of Altman, slavering, trying to bite his face. Altman got his hands up against his shoulders and tried desperately to hold him away, watching the man bare his teeth and shake his head like a wild animal. But he was too heavy, was bearing down too hard, and his teeth getting closer and closer to Altman's face. He cried out and pushed out as hard as he could, genuinely terrified now, trying to roll him off, but failing. Just when he thought he couldn't get him back anymore, the battyscaf's hatch hissed open, and a guard dropped in and wrapped an arm around Hendrix's neck. Altman scrambled back and away, dodging a second guard who dropped down and scurried up the ladder to the hatch. There was a group of guards around the hatch, pointing their weapons at him when he came out. He pushed past and, stumbling, rolled off the curve of the battyscaf, not onto the catwalk, but into the water. He had only a few seconds. Holding his breath, he floundered briefly to the observation porthole, tugging the square of cloth from his pocket and using it to gather up the pale pink swath. Through the porthole, he caught a glimpse of Hendrix struggling with two guards who had forced him back on the floor. He balled up the sodden cloth and thrust it deep in his pocket and returned to the surface. He broke to shouts and cries. Hands were immediately there, pulling him onto the catwalk and out of the water. Somebody wrapped a blanket around him. "Don't kill Hendrix," he heard himself shouting. "He doesn't know what he's doing." And then he was hustled out. 38. They let him stop off in his room to get a change of clothing. He managed to slip the rag out of his pocket and force it and the pink substance into an empty water bottle. He secured it in his drawer and then let the men lead him out. He stripped his clothes off and showered. When he stepped out, he saw that his clothing was gone. When he asked the guards about it, they didn't answer. He got dressed as the guards impassively watched. When he was done, they opened the door and gestured him out. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Debriefing," one said. A few minutes later, he was on the command deck. As soon as he entered, the other people in the room started to clear out. In the end, only he and Markov were left. "All right," said Markov. "Let's hear it. Tell me everything." He told him almost everything. He mentioned the strange fish, knowing that Markov would see the vid recording anyway. He told him about the pink swaths, but didn't mention the sample he had retrieved. He told him about the problem with the MRVs, that they either weren't receiving their commands or had failed in some other way. He described the progress that had been made. Markov just nodded. "What happened with Hendrix?" he asked. "How's he doing?" Markov shrugged. "Delirious," he said. "They're shooting him full of something to calm him down. He keeps talking about his father." "He was doing that down there," Ullman said. "He thought he saw his father outside the battyscaf. He wanted to let him in." He gave a wry smile. "I quite understandably was opposed to this." "I thought Stevens gave him a clean bill of health," said Markov. "He did," said Altman. "No reason to think otherwise. I thought he was okay most of the way down. He was a friend. I'm sorry this happened to him." "He was unstable." No, said Altman. I think there's more to it than that. He told Markov the whole story, only glossing over the end, suggesting that it was Hendricks himself who had wriggled free of his bonds. We did diachronic tracking of the pulse signal, Altman said. The strange thing is that it seemed to correspond to Hendricks' mental decay. When the signal was stronger, he started seeing things, became paranoid and violent. When it was weaker, he seemed to be like he normally is. I think the signal changed him. Markov looked at him a long time. That doesn't seem possible, he finally said. I know it doesn't, said Altman, but it correlated perfectly. I think the pulse signal does something to the human brain. Why didn't it do the same thing to you? Who knows, said Altman. Maybe I can resist it for some reason, or maybe it's doing things that I haven't managed to notice yet. What do you think it is? Markov asked again, just as he had asked 2 weeks before in Altman's kitchen. I don't know, said Altman. I haven't even seen it yet, but I can tell you one thing. It scares the living shit out of me. They were both silent for a while, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Markov looked up. You'll have to go down again, he said. Now? Soon. We need to add some equipment to the console so that you can communicate with the MORVs. Funny, said Altman. What's funny? I was going to suggest doing that, he said, adding something to the console. Markov gave him a quizzical look. You did suggest it, he said. That was one of the first things you said to us. Don't you remember? Are you all right? I must have been more rattled than I realized, Altman thought. He thought about how to answer Markov, rapidly deciding the best strategy was to ignore it. As long as it's not with Hendricks, I'm willing. I don't mind going down alone. Not alone, said Markov. I want you to take a few trips down. We'll try a different person each time. How do I know they're not going to react like Hendricks did? I was lucky with him. I may not be lucky next time. You become more important than I expected you to be, Markov said. You know how to run the battyscaff and take the proper measurements, which means I'm counting on you. I need you to do this. I need you to do this. And in exchange, Markov gave him a level stare. No, and in exchange, you'll do it. Is that a threat? Altman asked. When I'm threatening you, you'll know. Altman closed his eyes. If it wasn't a threat, it wasn't far from one. He knew he didn't really have a choice. All right, he said, but I want a tranquilizer gun just in case, and I want whoever goes down with me to be strapped to his chair. Agreed, said Markov. He stood and made a show of shaking Altman's hand. Thank you for your cooperation. I'll be in touch. "39. Hendricks woke up in a strange place, some sort of medical facility. The last thing he could remember was being on the battyscaff. He and Altman were going down, and then his head had started to hurt so much he could hardly stand it. After that, it all felt like a dream. There had been some kind of problem. He remembered Altman speaking calmly to him, remembered taking readings, but also remembered the feel of the floor. He must have fallen. Maybe they hit something. He felt groggy. Parts of his body were numb, and parts of his brain felt like they had been torn out. There was a tube running into his forearm. Maybe they were experimenting on him. He looked around. He was the only one there. He moved furtively out of the bed, peeling the tape off the tube in his arm and pulling it out. It burned coming out. He dropped it, left it dripping beside the bed, and stumbled to the door. It was locked. He stayed there, staring at the handle. After a while, he heard the sound of footsteps in the hall outside. He rushed back into his bed and half closed his eyes. Through his eyelashes, he watched the door open. A woman came in, dressed in white, carrying a hollow board. She walked straight to his bed. His mind pictured him running out of the door at the far end of the room. But in the end, his body did not move. "Hello," said the woman. "How are we today?" He didn't say anything, still pretending to be asleep. "Oh dear, you've torn your IV out again," she said. "We can't have that, can we?" She bent down for the end of the tube. It was at that moment that his body decided to reach up and grab her wrist. True, he was in his body. He was watching through his eyes, but it was doing things he wasn't telling it to do. He wasn't the one controlling it, which meant there must be someone else in there with him. As soon as he thought that, it felt like everything was happening at a little distance, like he had sunk deeper into his body, like he'd never been in control of the body again. And yet he could still feel everything. He watched the hand holding the nurse pull her on top of him like she was a doll. He felt the jaw opening and the teeth closing around the nurse's neck, and then a series of wet sounds as the neck burst open and warm blood spilled across his chin and his own neck. Her wrist, the one he was holding, he saw was broken, crushed, and the arm attached to it was no longer sitting in the socket right. She was trying to gasp for breath, but there was a hole in her windpipe now, and all that came out was a hissing and mist of blood. Her face was there just above him, her eyes terrified for a moment, but almost immediately becoming loose in their orbits as she lost consciousness. A few seconds later, after his body had done a few more things to her, he was certain she was dead. If he'd been asked to describe how exactly it had happened, he wouldn't have been able to say, though he was fairly certain he had done something to do with it, that he had something to do with it. Or not him, actually, his body. One moment she was alive, even if just barely. And then there was an awful blur of things happening. When they stopped, she was dead. He padded softly to the door and tried it. It was still locked. How was that possible? She'd come through it, hadn't she? She must have had a key. He shambled back to her corpse in search of her pockets, but he couldn't find any pockets. She was too much of a mess. Pushing his bloody hands through the sopping remains of clothing and flesh, he finally found something hard that wasn't a bone. He had just straightened up, bloody key in hand, when he realized that he wasn't alone in the room after all. There was a shape there, in the shadows of the last bed. "Who is it?" he said. "Don't you recognize me?" a voice said. He went a little closer, then closer still. It was as if the person was both there and not there at the same time. And then suddenly he felt a piercing pain in his head. He staggered. When he looked back up, he knew who it was. "Dad," he said. "Good to see you, Jason," he said. "Come sit down. I want to have a serious talk with you." "What about, Dad?" But his dad wasn't where he thought he was. He turned around and found him in another bed. "We're failing, Jason," his dad said. "You should leave that thing down where you found it. Convergence is not the only thing that matters." "Convergence?" asked Hendrix, then had to search frantically for his father, who somehow had moved again. "They want us all to become one, son." He gave a mournful smile, shaking his head. "Can you imagine?" he asked. He said, "Who's they, Dad?" "We have to be very careful, or there will be nothing left of us." Then his dad smiled. It was a beautiful smile, like he used to give Jason back when he was very young, just a few years old. Jason had forgotten that smile, but now it all came flooding back. "Tell them, Jason," he said. "Tell everyone." "I will, Dad," he whispered. I will. There was some noise behind him, but he didn't want to look away from his father's face. If he did, he feared he'd never find it again. Then there was shouting. He ignored it as long as he could, but it was too powerful. He turned around and moved toward it. There was a roar and a flash, and he was suddenly on the ground, staring up at the ceiling. I should get up and tell them, he thought. When he tried, he couldn't move. I'll just lie here, he thought. Dad? He whispered, but there was no answer. 40. Can I have a copy of this? asked the ichthyologist, watching the vid. Ullman shrugged. Sure, he said. What do you think? I've never seen anything quite like it, he said. Those strange horn-like projections. I don't have a precedent for those. You may have discovered a new species, or maybe the result of a mutation of some kind. I can ask around, see if anybody's seen anything like it, but I never have. So it's unusual. Very unusual. Well, Almond asked. He was in Scud's lab, the water bottle with him. The pinkish swath had been extracted from it and placed into a specimen tube. From this, Scud had taken a tiny sample, running a genetic test. It's strange, said Scud. It's tissue. What sort of tissue? Living tissue, said Scud. Like flesh. It was once alive, but it has a very unusual genetic profile. So, is it skin that has been torn off something? I don't think this is so, said Scud. I think it was alive not so long ago. It was alive when you found it. Maybe even alive until you bottled it. That can't be, said Altman. When I found it, it was just like this, but in big sheets. It couldn't have been alive. Yes, said Scud. It is a very simple organism. I do not know what it is. It has no brain and no limbs and was made of almost nothing at all, but it was technically alive. Altman shook his head. You're a doubter, I see, said Scud. I can prove it with a simple experiment. He upturned the sample vial, leaving the pink swath lying curled on the table. He took a battery with a pair of wires connected to it, sparked them against each other, then touched them to one another. Immediately, the swath jolted, moved. You see? Said Scud proudly. Alive. Don't, said Ada. It's morbid. It's not morbid, said Altman. I'm just stating the facts. This is just anecdotal, mind you, but it still must mean something. She rolled her eyes. Just listen, said Altman. Just listen and give me a hand. He held up one finger. You were the one who started this back in the town. I'm just going to give you the same talk you gave me, more or less. Nearly everybody I've talked to on the ship has a headache. Even if I haven't heard them say it out loud, I've seen them clutching their heads. That's not normal. It's just anecdotal, said Ada. It's not scientific. I said that already, said Altman. It could be a gas leak, said Ada, or a problem with the ventilation system. It could be, said Altman, but most of those people have been having headaches long before that. They've been having them ever since the first signal broadcast. He held up a second finger. Insomnia, he said. I've asked around about this. Showalter has it. I have it off and on. That German scientist has it. I heard the 2 guards outside of the command center complaining about it, and then later another 3 in the main dome. Have you had it? No, said Ada. But I've been having weird dreams. That's the other thing people are talking about, said Altman, raising another finger. Strange, vivid dreams. I've had them too. Lots of people have. And then we get to the more extreme cases. He held up 2 more fingers. Attacks, he said, wiggling one, and suicides, he said, wiggling the other. Not scientific, I admit, he said. But we've only been talking a few minutes and I've already run out of fingers. I've never been around a place where I've seen so many of them. I've never been around a place where I've seen so many of either. I heard that Wenbo went crazy, said Ada. Tried to strangle one of Markov's men. I heard the same thing, said Altman. Similar thing happened with Clairbout and Dawson. And Lumley stabbed Ewing and then painted a set of weird symbols on the walls of his own room with his own shit. And who knows what we're not hearing about, what they're covering up. Ada shuddered. And poor Trussell, she said. He always seemed so stable. Suicides and attempted suicides. Don't forget Press. Frank Press? Did he attempt suicide? Not only did he attempt it, he succeeded. There must be at least 3 or 4 more on that list, too. Doesn't that seem abnormal? I mean, there are only 200 or 300 on board. That put the suicide rate up over 2%. That can't be normal, can it? Ada shook her head. It's not scientific, said Altman, waving his fingers around. But I still don't like what it's telling me. Ask around. See if I'm wrong. I hope to God I am. A few hours later, Markov appeared at his door. He was carrying a tranquilizer gun in his hand. It looked like an ordinary pistol, but with a longer and thicker barrel. A square cartridge near the barrel's end. Ever worked on one of these? He asked. Altman shook his head. He opened the cartridge. Darts go here, he said. Cartridge snaps in and out. There are CO2 cartridges in the grip, but you don't need to worry about changing those. We'll handle it. You pull this bolt back, he said, drawing back a lever on the gun's side, and set the safety like this. It's easy to thumb off. As long as the bolt's back, it'll shoot. Aim for flesh. It won't go through clothing? I didn't say that, said Markov. It'll go through clothing, but clothing means more chances of something going wrong. Aim for flesh. Or, if you're not much of a shooter, just try to push it up against the person's chest before you fire. He handed the tranquilizer over to Altman, who held it awkwardly. The dart contains a strong sedative. It'll take a few seconds to take effect, Markov said. It'll hurt going in, but probably not enough to slow a maniac down much. You sure you don't want a real gun? Altman shook his head. You leave in 15 minutes, Markov said. Hurriedly, he tracked down Ada and told her what was happening. I don't want you to go down there again, she said. It doesn't affect me. He kissed her again. Besides, I have no choice. But after what happened to Hendricks, I handled that all right, didn't I? We're still both in one piece, aren't we? She covered her mouth with one hand. You haven't heard, she said. Haven't heard what? Hendricks is dead. He killed a nurse. Tore her apart. They had to shoot him. Stunned, he collapsed onto the bed. He didn't trust himself to speak. Even more so than Moresby, this had been his fault. Maybe if he had turned back when Hendricks had first wanted, it wouldn't have happened. How many deaths would be on his conscience before it was all over? Ada was lying beside him, stroking his forehead. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry. And then, Michael, don't go. He shook his head. I have to go, he replied. I have no choice. Turning away from her, he climbed out of the bed and made his way heavily down to the submarine bay. Okay, that was the end of part 4. Altogether, there is 3 more parts to go before the end of this book. But this ends here. So thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya. I'm going to have to end the stream myself. And